Okay, our next speaker is Casey Roark.
They're great. So yeah, I'm Casey Roark. I'm currently a postdoc at the University of Pittsburgh, and this is my work on auditory and visual category learning in children. So category learning is a really important skill across modalities and across the lifespan. So we can think about challenges that might be useful for infants. So for example, infants need to learn to distinguish between these kind of face-like shapes and actual human faces. They need to distinguish between things in the auditory modality as well. So for example, the sounds that come at the beginning of the words bear and pear are quite similar to each other, but they have to kind of learn to distinguish these categories. As children grow older, they learn more complex categories, like the difference between cats and dogs or other taxonomic categories. And again, we can use an example from the auditory modality. They can use and learn categories of musical instruments. And we continue using this skill throughout our lifespan. So as an adult, you might learn something like the difference between these two species of birds if you're trying to get a new bird watching hobby. And you might also need to learn new sounds of new languages if you're trying to learn another language. So if Mandarin Chinese is not your native language and you don't speak another tonal language, you might need to learn to distinguish between tone categories that can actually be lexically contrastive in other languages. And so categories really help us organize the world around us. And so one of the key questions that I'm interested in answering is, how does perceptual category learning change across development? So we've talked about how categories are ubiquitous across the lifespan, but really very little is understood about the similarities or differences across modalities because these have really rarely been studied in the same population. And there are also specific reasons to expect that children might learn auditory and visual information differently. So there's some older studies that show that children actually learn better when they're presented information auditorily rather than visually, and adults show this kind of opposite pattern. They learn really well from visual information. In general, it might be easier to selectively attend to visual information than auditory information. And this is specifically relevant in development because children struggle to selectively attend to relevant information and filter out and ignore irrelevant information. And so these differences across modalities might have these consequences for what children are able to learn. And so we can also think about how we might learn categories with different information processing demands. And so I'm going to use a framework from the literature here of two different types of categories. So the first is rule-based kinds of categories, and the second is information integration types of categories. I'll also refer to these as their shorthand of RB and II types of categories. So focusing on these rule-based categories, I can give you a kind of example here where each dot in this plot here represents an individual stimulus, and the different colored dots represent members of different categories. And so these actual dimensions that I'm showing you on the plot correspond with dimensions that make up a Gabor patch. So it's a very simple visual image. So how narrow are the bars in the image and what are the orientation of those bars? And so if I just show you a few examples from these different categories and based on the orientation of those dots in the plot, you can see that to learn these categories, you really just need to selectively attend to that bar narrowness and completely ignore the bar orientation. And so here, these rule-based categories have this sort of easily verbalizable rule. It involves selective attention and working memory as individuals use hypothesis testing to figure out what's going on here in the categories. And so this also relies on some pretty explicit neural mechanisms, such as the prefrontal cortex. And we know that prefrontal cortex has this long developmental trajectory, continuing development throughout adolescence and even into early adulthood. So really then it follows that rule-based learning improves with age. Young children are worse at rule-based learning than adolescents, who are themselves worse at learning than adults. And then we can consider this other type of category, these information integration type categories. So we can still think of these categories as existing in the same kind of perceptual space here. So we can still consider these Gabor patch type stimuli. But now you see that you can't divide the red and blue stimuli here in this plot based on a single dimension alone. You need to use both dimensions to make your decision. And if I just show you those examples, like we've talked about before, you can see that it's not super easy to just kind of immediately tell these apart based on a simple rule. And so really we have a situation here where these are difficult to verbalize categories. They involve learning slowly through stimulus response associations involving posterior striatum. And importantly, compared to the prefrontal cortex, the striatum matures relatively early, around 7 years of age. And so this might lead us to think that maybe information integration category learning is going to be preserved in young children. Maybe they're just as good at it as adults. And in fact, the results are actually a bit mixed about this in the literature. Some studies show that learning is just as good in children and adults. Other studies show that children are still worse than adults. And so we really want to try to figure out how children solve these different problems. And again, here it's key to look at this learning in the same children to understand what's happening. So the different questions that we're going to be able to address in this study are, do children have this modality-specific bias in category learning? So specifically, are they going to be better at learning for auditory than visual information? Are children going to be better at information integration learning than rule-based learning? Again, coming from this hypothesis that it's due to these less developmentally sensitive striatal mechanisms versus prefrontal cortex. And then finally, we'll answer, how do children learn these categories with these different requirements across different modalities? So we'll look at accuracies as a measure of their performance and how well they learn, but I'm also really interested in understanding how they learn. So we'll investigate that as well. All right, so the approach that I'm going to take here is to take you through two experiments. The first, we're looking at learning across 8 to 12-year-old children. And then in the second part in the experiment, I'm going to compare learning in these children with learning in adults. And so the method here we used was to train children on 4 different types of categories in an online experimental paradigm using Gorilla. And so they learned 2 visual categories and 2 auditory categories. So the visual categories that they've learned, we've already talked about, the Gabor patches, and they learned a rule-based and an information integration type category. And the auditory categories are sort of analogs to these Gabor patches, but in the auditory modality. So they involve complex combinations of temporal and spectral information. And I'll play you an example, hopefully, of what that sounds like now. I was just very quiet. Hopefully got a little sense of that. Okay, so it's this kind of complex rhythmic kind of pattern, and it varies in this kind of complexity in the spectral domain. And so we trained children across 3 sessions, but 2 of those were the category learning sessions. And so they learned 2 tasks in each session, always 1 auditory and 1 visual to reduce carryover effects across a single modality. And everything else was otherwise counterbalanced. And so we also had cover stories because this is a kid-friendly task. You want to make it as interesting as possible for them. So for the auditory domain, we had them learning that 2 different aliens were talking, and they have to learn who made which noise. And as you maybe heard that little spectral ripple sound, they do sound quite alien-like. And then in the visual modality, we had a cover story with wizards, and the children needed to categorize which wizard was had this crystal ball, and the Gabor patches were presented inside the crystal ball. Okay, so then we can look at how well the children actually learn these categories across 4 blocks, and there were 50 trials in each of these blocks. And I'll show the categories here in different colors and the modalities as different line types. So overall, this is what we see in terms of children's performance. So pretty immediately, what you can see is that on average, children perform similarly across all 4 of these tasks. There's not a huge bias to learn the auditory over visual information or the information integration over the rule-based types of categories. And I'll also point out that children's performance here is relatively stable across blocks. You see them kind of boost up in that first block, and then they're kind of just staying at that same level of performance as they complete the task. And so then we can turn, as I said, to how they're actually performing these category learning tasks, how they actually use the information to make their decisions during learning. So to do this, we applied decision-bound models to examine their learning strategies. And really what these models allow us to do is look at a child's pattern of responses and tell whether they're primarily using a single dimension to separate the categories, or whether they're using multiple dimensions, or whether they're using some kind of inconsistent strategy that's not really captured by one of those 2 options. And so what I'll show you here is the proportion of participants in each of the 4 different tasks using these different strategies. So I'll color the strategy where they use multiple dimensions as this blue integration strategy. If they're using a single dimension, it'll be a color of green. And then if it's inconsistent, it'll be red. And this is what their strategies look like. So you can see that overwhelmingly children really are using inconsistent strategies. There's not a ton of rhyme or reason about their performance in these tasks, but the next most common strategy is this single dimension rule. And we can see that they're not really adapting this at all, depending on what type of task they're solving. They're showing this pattern in every single one of these tasks. And so returning to answer our questions from earlier, we see that children don't really have these modality-specific biases in learning. They learn the auditory and visual categories to similar extents. The children don't have this information integration kind of category bias. They learn the information integration and rule-based categories similarly. And then when we're looking at how they're solving these learning problems and their learning strategies, we see that they tend to approach the tasks pretty similarly using these inconsistent or single dimension learning strategies, no matter what they're being asked to learn. So then again, we can kind of return now to the adults and see and contextualize these results and see how adults approach these exact same learning tasks. So what we did is use the exact same paradigm in adults, still testing them online, and now we're recruiting them from Prolific, and we'll see how they learn in the same tasks. So once again, we can look at their accuracy across all 4 of these tasks across blocks, and this is what that looks like. So here we can see that while children perform similarly across the tasks, adults were especially good at learning one of the types of categories. And specifically, it's this visual rule-based type of category. It's this dashed red line here. And I'll also note that in contrast to the children who kind of just hit this single level of performance and maintain that throughout the task, the adults continue improving beyond the first block. Next, when we turn to look at how they solve the problems and the strategies they use, we see that while these children are using inconsistent or single dimension rules, no matter what they're learning, the adults are mostly tailoring their strategies based on the task at hand. So if you look in this first and third panel, which are the information integration type categories, we're seeing this blue pop up more there, meaning they're using multiple dimensions as they should. And in the second and fourth columns, we're seeing that rule-based usage as we should. But I'll also note here that there's tons of variability within the adults as well, and this comes out in their accuracy, and I'd be really happy to answer a question about that if anyone has one. So finally, we can directly compare adults and children. So I'm going to replot everything that I've already shown you in terms of accuracy, but just showing adults and children on the exact same plot. And so here we really see, somewhat unsurprisingly, that adults were generally better than children at all 4 of these learning tasks. But I want to point out 2 specific patterns here. And the first is in the first block, where now I'm just plotting the mean percentage differences between the groups. And so we actually see that children are just as good at learning as adults in the auditory rule-based and visual information integration category learning within those first 50 trials. There's no differences between children and adults. Instead, adults are consistently better at these other tasks, visual rule-based and information integration in the auditory modality. And then once we look at this pattern again in the fourth block, we're seeing that that difference now kind of pops up with all of the different categories and is actually higher for those categories they were already doing better than children at in the first block. And so we're really seeing that consistent difference for these 2 specific types of categories for auditory information integration and visual rule-based. So now to just wrap up what we've talked about and how I think we can interpret this. So first, we saw that adults really maximize their performance, but these 8 to 12-year-old children did not. So adults continue to improve across blocks, whereas children are kind of satisfied to just kind of stick with that ultimate level of performance they have at the beginning. And so we know that adults are really great at following rules, and I tell them to maximize their performance. They're really good at trying to achieve that goal and to continue to get more and more accurate. And children may instead be just kind of following their own goals. It might be that they're struggling to learn, but it also might just be that they're getting some other value from exploring different strategies or trying to learn about these aliens and wizards in different ways. We also saw that adults specifically tailored their approach to the specific challenge that they were learning, where children had this more generalized approach, where they're using similar strategies no matter what they're being asked to learn. And again, this is calling to the fact that I think that children are doing something that might just be a little less able to tap into. We might be less able to kind of put that kind of onus on them to follow our instructions exactly as we set them out to be. And so finally, we saw that adults specifically excelled in these two types of problems, these auditory information integration and visual rule-based problems. And I want to argue that I think that this is reflecting something in their adults' expertise in the natural world and how our natural world is organized. So for example, I can think of some problems that adults are experts at that children are still developing at that might reflect these challenges. So for example, in the auditory modality, adults are experts at speech perception. And so while many might assume that speech perception is done developing really early in life, it actually continues developing and isn't mature and adult-like until about 12 years of age. And so this is something that's still developing in our population here. So it's something that adults might be especially good at, is kind of tuning into this way of using multiple dimensions in the auditory modality to learn categories. And similarly, in the visual world, we might have the opposite approach, where adults might be really good at selectively attending to information and finding rules about the visual world. And this might reflect to their skills in something like reading, which is still developing in our child sample, where learning this letter to phoneme mapping might be something that adults are really, really experts at, whereas our children here are struggling. And so with that, I'd really like to thank you for your time, thank these resources that supported the work and my co-authors here.
Thank you. That was a nice talk. I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about, and sorry if I missed this, but did you ask the participants at the end whether they could explicitly articulate what the rule might be? So one of the things, the reason I asked, one of the things I was thinking was that this sort of meta awareness element is something that is going to be a lot more commonly the case for adults to be able to have, and that once you can articulate it, whether internally or aloud, that's going to help you do better in the task, because by the time you're an 8-year-old, you've done tons of very sophisticated category learning. You have a phonological system, you have a syntactic system, vocabulary items, you have lots of concepts and categories, but they're often not something that you are ever going to be articulating into rule-based or integration of two-dimension space, whereas adults have had lots of opportunities to actually discretize it. So all that's a long-winded way of asking, did you ask at the end whether they could articulate what the rules might have been?
Yeah, I love this question. And I think that is a really great point. So yeah, we did not ask them to articulate. And in hindsight, of course, that's like, we wish we would have asked them. But verbal reports in these kind of tasks, even in adults, are pretty unreliable. It kind of depends. They kind of think they're doing one thing, the responses reflect something else. So it could even be challenging, even if you did ask them, if kids didn't have like, oh yeah, I was doing this specific thing, it doesn't necessarily mean that they weren't kind of following a particular rule. But yeah, that's a great question. Thank you.
Thank you. So I was wondering, I noticed in those plots when kids, and I think adults as well, did single dimension strategies, they were way more likely to use the X dimension than the Y. So I was wondering if you had any speculation about why that is, were the stimuli set up such that, one might have been more salient than the other, and might this have interfered with kids' ability to integrate these two features?
A really great question. So this is very common. I think I'm trying to remember if it's as common with the Gabor patches, but I think people tend to have some sort of, if there are individual dimensions, they might just have one that they kind of pick and it's a good enough rule. And they're like, I'm just going to stick with this because it's good enough for me. So the temporal modulation dimension in the auditory stimuli is kind of like wah, 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 wah kind of sounds. It definitely is a salient dimension, and it probably is more verbalizable itself than the spectral dimension in the auditory modality. So there is this kind of difference there that definitely is an important consideration, especially when we're talking about if adults are actually just tuning into a single dimension and completely ignoring the other dimension, or if there's some kind of interaction at some level.
If people don't have another question, I might ask another. I was just curious about sort of your view, stepping back a little and looking at the prior work and this work, on whether, this sort of supports these two types of category learning as being separate processes in kids or not, like whether they're just not yet differentiated and maybe adults show differences in these two types because of something learned. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. So in the literature, there's this huge argument that I'm sure you're familiar of how you ask that question about whether this kind of learning of rule-based information integration categories is supported by a single or multiple systems. And I'm not sure that this really speaks to that necessarily in kind of either the children or the adults. And I guess I'll just be frank with that, because I think that the way that you solve a problem, the way that an individual solves a problem can be extremely varied across different individuals. And so it's possible that some adults are relying, if we have multiple systems, on one more of those systems, or that somehow this output of a single system is more efficient in those adults. So I think there's a lot more to answer about individual differences, both in adults and children, than I think that either single systems or dual systems accounts can really speak to right now. Thanks. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.